Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here and hold the Kissinger Chair, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and to be able to provide the introductions for our speaker today. First, let me just say our moderator for today is Andrew Hunter. He directs our Defense Industrial Initiatives Group and is a senior advisor in our International Security Program here at CSIS. But our keynote speaker for this morning is Frank Kendall. He is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics. He was confirmed as such in May of 2012. A great month for confirming people, I think, as I recall. He had previously served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics under one Ash Carter, and he has also served as the Acting Undersecretary in the time when Ash Carter had moved up to be the Deputy Secretary. Frank comes to this issue set from a very long history of expertise in acquisition from his time inside AT&L and government, his time inside the Army, and his time inside Raytheon and other organizations beyond government. There's really no one, I think, who has more expertise on defense acquisition and has survived more rounds of defense acquisition reform discussions than Frank Kendall. Before I give the stage over to him, I do need to give you a quick safety announcement. We have exit doors on either side of me going out this way behind me, and we have exits obviously behind you. Andrew Hunter is your safety officer. If a fire alarm or something goes off, he'll tell you which direction to go. We have across the street both a bar and a church, so depending on what the incident is, we'll take you to the appropriate one. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Frank Kendall.
Good morning. I'm going to use a few PowerPoint slides. I don't normally do that, but I thought I would today. I've got some data to show you, and I'm big on data. It is almost to the day, I think, 4 years since I was confirmed, but I did spend about better part of a year as acting before that. So I'm approaching, I think, the longest tenure of anybody in my position or the predecessor positions. And the reason I've stuck around so long is partly because I really like what I'm doing, but also because to affect change in an organization as vast as the Defense Department, it just takes a lot of time and a lot of consistency of purpose. And one of the things I do every year, started this a year ago, I've done it twice now, is ask every one of our ACAT 1 program managers to send me a 1 to 3 page assessment of their programs. And this year, I've added the program executive officers, so a total about 200 people. And I read every one, and I respond to every one, and I get a lot of great ideas from this. It's something I should have started much earlier. But one of the things that people express to me very often is that they really appreciate the consistency in policy and the fact that we're not changing every time we turn around. When I was in the Pentagon the first time, I was there from 1986 to 94. I worked for 8 different undersecretaries for acquisition. So in addition to the idea that it takes time to change the organization. Also, there's a value in consistently advocating for the same policies and keeping them around long enough so you can see if they actually work or not. You start to look at the data and get an indication of whether or not the things you've done are actually doing any good, or if you just can't tell. So I'm going to show you some of that in a moment. Okay, next chart. This is good old Better Buying Power 3.0. I am not going to walk you through this. This is the first of 3 charts that kind of talk about better buying power or acquisition reform activities. This is a form of acquisition reform. This is a work the details version of this. It's part of a management philosophy of continuous improvement as opposed to revolutionary change. I have been in this business for 40 plus years, and I've seen a lot of different fads come and go. They come from various sources. Some of them have been some of my predecessors. But at the end of the day, we live in a defense acquisition world in a very complicated, difficult world with lots of different problems of different types to solve. And so people have to really sweat the details, and they have to understand the details. So this has been a long list. It's an evolutionary list. It started with 1.0 that Dr. Carter and I did back 6 years ago almost. And it's evolved since then, but it's stayed much more constant than changed. And I briefed this before here at CIS, SIS, and other places. I won't go through all that. I do want to point out the bumper stickers, because I think these are kind of fundamental. The first one is about cost consciousness. Okay, that's how I kind of summarize Better Buying Power 1.0 from 2010. And the idea there was that our managers weren't just responsible for enforcing their contracts and spending their money on time so nobody took it away, one of our more perverse incentives. They were responsible for controlling their costs and getting cost out wherever they could. They had a responsibility to the taxpayer, they had a responsibility to the department and the warfighters to do that. So elevating that, I think, is one of the more fundamental things we did. And something we've had in all the Better Buying Power sets of initiatives has been this idea of should cost. As you attack as a manager your cost structure, you analyze it, you look for opportunities to improve, and then you go set targets for yourself, you go after those. And that, if there's anything that I think I've done in the last 6 years as far as cultural change or a change that is widespread throughout the workforce, it is that. It is that people are now paying a lot more attention to their cost and working hard to control their cost. And I'll show you some evidence that that's really making a difference. The second one, professionalism, is really what Better Buying Power 2.0 was about. We added that, I added that. I think Dr. Carter and I really made a mistake, frankly, in not including that in the first one. I added a category, which I would carry through any future edition of this, about building up our workforce. And it's the capability of tens of thousands of professionals in the government workforce and the people in industry that they work with that actually deliver our products, that actually get the job done across all those hundreds of different programs, those thousands of different transactions, hundreds of thousands of transactions, all the things we do where we spend the taxpayers' money through contractors to get the work done that we need. But the professionalism of our workforce and the ability of our workforce to manage all those activities, make smart decisions in all those different business situations is at the heart of this. And the third one up there is on technical excellence, which brought us back, and that's what 3.0 emphasized. 3.0 brought us back to a focus on the superiority of our weapon systems through technical excellence. And an ability to manage risk and control programs much more effectively from that perspective. So it kind of brought us back to some of our roots. I've been speaking for years now about my concerns about technological superiority. And I decided in 3.0 to orient it on that problem more and focus on our engineering expertise, our scientific expertise, and on innovation. You hear a great deal about innovation right now. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but bringing technologies more quickly into our weapon systems and ensuring that those weapon systems are superior to any potential adversaries is at the heart of 3.0. But it continued, as I said earlier, we continued a lot of the things from earlier editions. So the next chart is about how we're doing. This came out, some analysis, a team that works for me, led by Phil Anton, who's in the audience, compiled last fall. Came out a little bit after I published my annual report on the performance of the acquisition system, so I didn't have it to include when that came out. But it's pretty interesting indication of how we're doing at controlling costs in our contracts. The chart depicts data drawn from about 1,123 is the number, contracts for major programs. These are programs for which we get earned value reporting. So it's the programs that are higher risk, and in many cases are bigger programs. They're major defense acquisition programs. 240 of them, over 1,100 contracts, rather. And you can see the pre-Goldwater Nichols world in which things were getting worse. One of the reasons the Packard Commission was commissioned was to address the problem of cost overruns and schedule slips and so on in defense programs. And the acquisition executive at the DAE, Defense Acquisition Executive's position, the Undersecretary for originally acquisition, was created about the point of number 2. And you can see in the post-Goldwater Nichols era a significant improvement. Down is better on this chart, right? Cost growth is bad, so down is better. And you can see it's a 5-year moving average. We did that to smooth out the data. The data is very noisy, but it gives you a better indication of general trends. And you can see over the next decade or so, things got better. Now, I also point out whenever I brief this chart that I came to the Pentagon in 1986. I left in 1994. I came back in 2010, and I'm still there. But just put that in the back of your mind. But I don't take a lot of credit for the policies of the Undersecretary for Acquisition, but one of the things that those people did, what they brought to the department, was a focus on the business side of things. A lot of them came from non-commercial, or non-defense rather, industry. Car companies, for example. We had a couple from Ford, one from General Motors. And I worked for a number of those people over that period of time. And we became much more conscious of the way we were doing business, the kinds of deals we were striking, what we were getting for our money, and how we were managing risk. And you can see the results up there. Things got better for about a decade. Then we went into an era in the mid-90s, and there were various versions of this, but they all had the same, some things in common. There was reinventing government, which was largely about getting rid of government standards and regulation. There was transformation, which was about being much more aggressive in terms of how we did things, in terms of change. And there was total system performance, which was the idea that you give industry complete responsibility for a program from birth to death. One of the things that ran through all of those was less government oversight and management of our contractors. Was the idea that we should get the money to the contractors, they know how to do this, and get the bureaucracy and so on out of their way. And you can see the results that occurred as a response to that. Things got worse for some time. And then we started, in 2010, the Better Buying Power initiatives, which were about bringing cost consciousness back into the priorities of the managers for the Department of Defense, and doing a lot of things on a lot of different fronts to try to bring our contracts under control. Now, I have looked at this data a lot of different ways. I've had my team go through it because I didn't want to brief something like this unless I was pretty confident that it actually showed reality. And we have scrubbed it pretty carefully. Underlying all of this, there are about three things going on. One is that there's a constant. Okay, you see it portrayed up there as the 31-year average. If we continue on the path we're on, we're going to bring that constant down. It's going to get less. But there's a constant term here. Programs tend to overrun more than they underrun. There's a cyclical parameter in here, which is about the budget climate that we're in. I'll show you some more data on this in a moment. But essentially, we behave differently when budgets are tight than when they're not. And then, on top of that, there's all the things we do about policy. And the policy ones are the hardest to pull out. They're the least strong correlator, except for this general correlation you see here. And I don't take credit for that dip from 4 to 5 personally. I think all of our workforce, and to some degree industry, should get credit for that. That's the work of an awful lot of people. If there's one thing that, starting with together with Dr. Carter, and since he moved up as the Undersecretary, I have done, is to raise the priority for our people of controlling cost and getting better business deals and negotiating better with industry that results in better business deals. And that's the trend we're on, and I hope to continue it. Let me show you another chart. The next one is profitability. One of the concerns when we came out with Better Buying Power initially was that it was going to be a war on profit. This was way back 6 years ago to 1.0. We always said, no. Profit's a tool to get better results. And we expect industry has to make a profit. It's not optional for industry to make a profit. We want people to make a reasonable profit so they're attracted to do business with us. We don't want outrageous profits, but we want reasonable profits. And we don't want to take your money away to save cost. What we want to do is incentivize you through profit to cut cost. Profit is on the order of 10, 12% of what we spend. It's that other 80 or 90% that we care about. That's where we want you to make gains for us. So over this whole period of time, you've got the one aberration there with General Dynamics. Profits done reasonably well for industry. This has not been done at the expense of industry. We're controlling cost without lowering margins, basically. This is EBITDA data. The exception to that is Boeing Defense Systems up there, which we don't have reporting at that level, but the trend for Boeing you can see on that one chart. Okay, I've got a few other charts. I'm going to do these really quickly. Talk about some other metrics of performance and how we're doing. Okay, this one is development. This is major programs again. It's cost growth, taken on a 2-year average in this case. And you can see over the last few years, again, the behaviors are much better. That's again, indicative that some of the things we're doing are working. The next one is procurement, early phases of procurement. See similar data. In fact, in many cases in procurement, we're coming in below our initial estimates, below our baselines. Next chart. This is cost growth relative to negotiated cost targets. And again, you see the trend that's in the positive direction. There's always a lot of scatter in this data, but this gives you to indicate overall where you're going. The next one is programs realizing savings, and you can see a snapshot from 2009 and a snapshot from 2014. Dramatically better in 2014. We're doing quite a bit better in terms of the percentage of programs getting savings and how much they're getting. These aren't huge numbers, by the way, but we're on the right side of the line. That's a very strong indication. The next chart is similar. It's for production. And again, positive trends across the board. One of the charts I don't like too much, but it's one that we pay attention to in this town a lot, is Nunn-McCurdy's. Next chart. And that shows things coming down in general for number of queries. I think we had 1 in 2015, if I remember right. Okay, contract lengths. There's a belief that our contracts are getting longer. The data does not support that. And generally, they're getting shorter. There may be a correlation to the complexity and the phase that we're at here. When you try to correct for that, it looks flatter. But in general, we are not seeing great stretch outs in terms of contract times. People hold up the F-35 as if it were an example of a typical program. It's anything but. Okay, so next chart's an important one. I've talked about this one before. It's essentially how budget climate affects our results. This was done by Dave McNichol out at IDA. And basically, it shows that when money is tight, programs that are started then, that are baseline then, have much worse performance than programs that are started when money is what Dave calls obliging. This is a very strong correlation, and it tells you that when budgets are tight, we behave differently than when budgets are not tight. Budgets are tight now, so I'm watching new starts and programs that we're baselining now very carefully to make sure we don't repeat this history any more than absolutely necessary. What happens then? I think it's quite simple. I think people tend to be more optimistic then because they want to get things in their budget that aren't going to fit. So they gamble on what things will cost, and they gamble on how long they'll take, and they put optimistic assumptions into what they do. Industry is also motivated in those kinds of climates to bid more aggressively because it's much more important that they win things. Okay, so that's a lot of the data. I'm working my way down through successively less lengthy and complicated versions of acquisition reform. The next chart, Better Buying Power Principles, came about because when any leader has a set of initiatives or a policy which he puts a label on, like Better Buying Power, people start to parrot that back to you all the time. And I kept getting briefings or papers coming before me that talked about Better Buying Power Principles. And I thought that was amusing because I'd never articulated any Better Buying Power Principles. But I sort of get the idea. And I would often put people on the spot and ask them, well, which ones are you particularly impressed by or using? The people kind of got the deer in the headlights look when I did that. But I thought about it, and I said, there actually are Better Buying Power Principles that are behind the sets of initiatives, the 23 original ones, the 35 odd ones, and the other 2 additions, that did motivate all the other specific things we're doing. And it's kind of good to come back to first principles once in a while, think about what they are, and make sure you're aligned with them in general. So I came up with a list, and I worked with a couple of our classes out at Defense Acquisition University, got some feedback from them, and have rearranged things a little bit as a result of that and changed the wording a little bit. I'm going to run through these very quickly with you because I think these are kind of basics. And I thought about these are intended for our workforce, okay? They were originally intended to be a set of things the workforce could look at and kind of internalize, perhaps. But as I think about acquisition reform in the Congress and the public domain, a lot of them really apply there also. If I were writing, I feel that Congress, which keeps trying to do acquisition reform cycle after cycle, has some very fundamental limitations on the tool of legislation and with what you can accomplish with that tool. It's very hard to make people better managers and leaders, which is really what we need, or better engineers or scientists by writing a law. It's very hard to prescribe what you can do in a policy that's generally applicable. I worked closely with Chairman Thornberry on his recent bill, and the original version of it was very rigid in some of its prescriptions. And I'm delighted to say that he listened to my comments and my staff's comments and others and gave us more flexibility than the original bill would have had. We have to have flexibility. Rigid rules always end up being the wrong thing to do in certain situations. Our rule is just too complicated. But let me run through these really quickly for you. Principle 1, people matter most. You can never be too professional or too competent. And I did my original list of these. I had this number 6 or something, not because it was number 6 in importance, but because that's how that slide with all the Better Buying Power initiatives on it is organized. And one of the classes I talked to said, sure, that really ought to be first, and they were right, so I moved it up to number 1. Building the workforce, reinforcing the workforce, supporting it, making sure that it gets the right training and education, making sure that people have adequate tenure on the job, get the right mix of experience. In the government in particular, we have to grow our managers. They're either uniform people who come up through a career in uniform, or they're civil servants who generally come to us early in their lives, out of college often, and then stay. We don't have the kind of flexibility to bring people in from the marketplace. Now, one of the things Secretary Carter is trying to do right now is make the department more permeable so we can get more people in. Our ethics laws, our compensation scheme, and other things mitigate against that. So anything we can do to attract and retain talent is going to matter, and to develop that talent. The next one is behind all of the better buying power initiatives, one way or the other, is the idea that data should drive policy. We shouldn't just try something because what we don't like, what's going on right now isn't what we'd like it to be, and just grab at something else and hope that's better. We ought to actually, we've had a lot of history now of acquisition. And what my Phil Sell and others have done is go back and analyze that data and try to correlate results to policy. And what you find out, and what Dave McNichol, by the way, found out, the other part of that chart that I showed of his was the first part was budgets matter, budget climate matters. The other part was acquisition organization at the top of the Department of Defense in terms of DSARCs versus DABs versus other committees or other forms of management didn't seem to have much of a correlation, which I thought was interesting too. The next part is that critical thinking is necessary for success. The whole of Better Buying 2.0 about professionalism was about that. 1.0 was largely about, here are some good policies, you should generally follow these, but don't always follow them, which many people didn't pay attention to that last part. Better Buying Power 2.0 was largely about tools to help people do a better job of making the judgments that they have to make. But it isn't enough to just follow a checklist. Checklists are not going to get us there. Our world is too complicated for that. Controlling lifecycle cost is one of our jobs. Staying on budget isn't enough. That's sort of a cultural change. Worse than that, we have perverse incentives to spend the money no matter what. I often talk about the F-35 decision to start production. Well before test flights were far enough along that we had any confidence at all the design was stable, and then we paid a big price for that. But what motivated people more than anything else, I think, was, and I've talked to some of the people involved, was the money was sitting there in the budget for production. And if you didn't spend it, you would, quote, lose the money. So off we went, right? The idea that money that you don't spend is lost, or that people will take your money away for not spending it, really isn't what we want. It's not the right pressure to have on us in a negotiation. It's not necessarily the right pressure to have on us in execution. We've made a lot of progress over the last few years in striking a better balance there. But in general, as I've said earlier, controlling lifecycle cost is one of our jobs, and I think we've had a fair amount of success in getting people on board with that. Continuous improvement will be more effective than radical change. I was asked very early on if I was a revolutionary or an evolutionary leader. It was an interview by somebody from the press. And I thought about it for a second because I hadn't anticipated the question. And I thought, well, I think I'm an evolutionary leader. I think that continuous change on the margins is the right way to gain ground. But if you do that long enough and consistently enough, you have done a revolution. Okay, I think that first chart I showed you and that trend down, that sharp trend down, is in a way a revolution in our performance. But it was done in an evolutionary manner. Another reason to stick around long and try to have consistent policies. The next one's pretty basic. Incentives work. Incentives work for industry, okay? The profit incentive, and industry is very simple. Industry is trying to make money, and if their behavior will be motivated by that, almost period. They care about other things too. They care about other things that are related to that, but that's a very powerful tool. We can't misuse that tool. We need to use our clout with industry, if you will, our leverage with industry in a way which takes care of them, is fair to them, and gives them reasonable returns, but also gets more of what we want. And that's not as easy as it sounds. So we've made great improvements. One of the things we've done with industry is, it's part of Better Buying Power 3.0, is we have started monetizing performance differentials for them so that industry knows when it bids whether it should bid a higher performance level or not, based on how much that's going to affect their bid price. If it comes in below what we're willing to pay, it's a good thing to do. If it comes in above what we're willing to pay, it's not a good thing to do. We've done that successfully a number of times right now. It's very straightforward. It requires our operators, and one of the things, by the way, that's happened recently with the Hill is the greater involvement of service chiefs. This is an area where the service chiefs can be enormously helpful, because they're the customers. They're the ones who are looking out over their service budget, trying to decide what they can fit into that budget to get the right balance for their service. They're the ones who can make the judgment about whether it's worth 10% more in the unit cost of whatever thing they're buying to get a little bit more performance or not. That's something we're asking them to do now routinely, and it's working very, very well in store selections. It also helps us to survive protests because we have an objective standard that we're using. Competition is the best way to incentivize industry. It's the most effective incentive that we have, and we've had a lot of success, I think, in creating competition in competitive environments. It isn't just head-to-head competition, and I use the ELV as an example of this. The fact that SpaceX was going to be there as a competitor for ELV had an enormous impact on ULA well before SpaceX was actually competing with them. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. I think we've gotten better at that. That's motivated industry to be leaner and more effective for us, more efficient. Acquisition's a team sport. It's very much a team sport with the warfighter, with the requirements generators, with the operators. It's also a team sport with the intelligence community as we get more and more concerned about responsive threats and technological superiority. It's a team sport with a number of others too, the financial management community, the policy community, and certainly the Congress. Our managers have to work in an environment which a lot of people care about the outcome and do it successfully together as a collaborative activity. I've had in my past a number of cases where there were problems on both sides with this, where the requirements people would say, here's my requirement, I don't want to have anything more to do with this, just go build this. And the acquisition person would say, I'm building this, leave me alone, I don't want to talk to anybody else, this is my requirement, this is what I'm doing. Neither one is right, okay? We need to work together and do that effectively. The configuration steering boards, which we've emphasized, is one vehicle to do that. The next one, number 9, motivates all of 3.0. There are elements of it earlier on, but I stay awake at night much more worried about technological superiority than I do about acquisition reform or the mechanics of how we do business. I have been doing this for 6 years. I've been looking at the Intel reports for 6 years, and nothing in that intervening period of time has made me less concerned about this, quite the opposite. The last one was phrased differently the first time I wrote it. I think I said, don't do stupid. And people thought that might be interpreted incorrectly. So I wasn't telling people they were stupid anymore than I was telling people they weren't professional. And I changed it to kind of emphasize the positive. I have seen many times in my career a manager at mid or lower level who will say, well, this is really stupid, but that's the policy, so that's what we have to do. You know, we're supposed to use this kind of contract, so even though it's clearly the wrong kind of contract for what I'm doing, I'm going to use it anyway. And there are lots and lots of examples of that. And the point of this was to get our people, particularly younger people, but it applies at all levels, stand up and be counted and go to your supervisor and say, hey, this is really a bad idea when it's a bad idea. You know, we don't get better policies unless people have the courage to challenge them. And often it's the implementation of the policy in the specific instance that we're talking about. As I was reading this, I thought, well, in my earlier comment as I was getting ready for today, you know, I guess I'm in the same boat when it comes to acquisition reform and things that the Congress wants to do, so I'm going to have to follow my own principle there, I think. Okay, this is the next chart is what keeps me awake at night. If you look at that, that's the structure of our R&D accounts, and I've been talking about this for some time. If you look at the science and technology accounts at the bottom of the chart, 6, 1, 2, and 3, we have in this administration for the last several years protected those accounts very well. They're reasonably constant. We had $12.5 billion roughly in those accounts this year in the 17 request. They've been protected. This is the science and technology that ultimately comes into our weapon systems. It includes university research, includes a lot of basic research at our laboratories and with our defense contractors and with commercial industry. Okay, so that's the force after next, if you will, that technology supports. Then you come up to and I'm going to go to the top of the chart next. 6, 7 up at the top is the upgrades to the things we have, for the most part. There are a couple of other things in there as well, but it is for the most part the upgrades to the things that we have. And what this chart tells you is that is by far the biggest of our research and development accounts right now. That's where we're investing more money than anywhere else, upgrading the things we have. The reason we're doing that is we're keeping them a lot longer than we had planned. And so we're inserting upgrades of technology to them where we can to prolong their lives and to enhance their capabilities. Then there's the part that I'm worried about the most. That's the 6.4 and 6.5 accounts. This is what I call our new product pipeline. 6.4 is the risk reduction work you do before you commit to development for production. So this is where our new products that we're to some degree committed to exist in the budget. And you can see the drop in those since the mid-2010 era, the first 5 to 10 years. And in fact, the 6.4 account is now and has been for some time bigger than the 6.5 account. 6.5 is engineering and manufacturing development. It's the stuff where we're making the big commitments to get ready for production and do production representative prototypes. That one is well below our experimental risk reduction work now. Now, what we did in this budget, that concerns me. I didn't bring it with me because it's classified, but I'll describe it to you. I've had the intelligence community build charts for me. They're poster-sized charts that show all of the products, the new product pipeline for our potential adversaries, our more near-peer competitors, China and Russia. And if you look at both of them, China in particular, though, they're dense with new products. A couple of years ago, I had the same poster made for the United States, for the Department of Defense, and it's a lot of white space. There's a significant difference in the rate of modernization, the scale and scope, breadth and depth of modernization between us and our most challenging adversaries. And that's because of these charts, because we're not spending as much on new product pipeline. So that concerns me more than anything else. Now, what are we doing about this? We've been aware of this for some time. What we have tried to do in this budget, Secretary Carter's budget, the one he has most put his stamp on, is shift our balance towards R&D. What we did, if you look closely at the numbers, is we added some money for readiness. We're still trying to dig out of the hole that we created in sequestration in 2013 for readiness. We have a lot going on around the world, in case you haven't noticed. So it's important to have the current force be reasonably ready. So we increased readiness spending by about $6 billion. We cut procurement by about $6 billion. So that's not on this chart. That's a separate account. And we added about $3 or $4 billion to R&D. Where did we add it? We added it mostly in the 6.4 account. Some in 6.3 also, but mostly in 6.4. This is experimental work that is doing demonstrators of novel ideas and new technologies. A lot of them come out of the thing we're calling the third offset strategy work. One of the initiatives on that early chart with all the better buying power 3.0 things was something called the long-range R&D planning activity, planning program. Steve Welby, the Assistant Secretary for Research and Engineering, led that effort. Out of that were a number of recommendations for risk reduction programs, demonstrations, and those were funded in the budget. The Strategic Capabilities Office that Will Roper runs also has some demonstration projects that are funded in the budget. Those are added. That's one of the things we did with that additional R&D money. But those things are all the earlier stages of development. They're not the development of, they're not well into the new product pipeline where they're development for production. That would have to follow. So we'll be taking a look at what would be required to get from those demonstrators to a producible design that you could field in quantity. We'll look at that in this next cycle and see if we can get any of those into the budget. For the next 2, 3, or 4 years, we're focused on those demonstrators. When I look at the longer-term health of the department and the budget, I'm concerned about our ability to continue those projects, to afford that, and I'm concerned our ability to do it, particularly when we get into the 2020s, where the strategic triad has to be recapitalized, and the bill for that gets heavy. We have got to get out of the sequestration thing and start having an informed debate about the right level of investment for national security. There are compelling reasons for us to do that, but in 2018, we're going to be back into that climate of uncertainty that we've been living in for the last few years. Okay, I promised you a short version of acquisition reform, and here it is. If you only walk away from this presentation with one thing, you can take this with you. I thought about this, and this has evolved in my own mind over the last few months to come down to this. The problem with these 4 bullets is that there is a world of complexity and nuance and difficulty in every one of them. Setting reasonable requirements, right? Enough but not too much. Comparable with the risks, adequate to give us an advantage. Flexibility as you learn, as you go forward, and what's reasonable, the definition of what reasonable changes over time. But you start with that. Programs start with requirements. In our system, requirements come from the services and they come from the operators, almost uniformly. I have, in the last few years, on occasion, maybe more than on occasion, tried to get some innovative things into our budget to move technology and weapons concepts forward where the services hadn't proposed them. I'm betting about 500 on that, okay? But for the most part, our programs come out of service initiatives. So you start with requirements, then put professionals in charge. There's no substitute for professionalism, and I'm talking about government particularly here, but I would also talk about people at jobs like mine, and I would also talk about in industry. We get in a lot of trouble when we let people manage programs who don't have the right experience, the right professional background. We get a lot of trouble when we hire people who don't have the background in their corporation. They have to go out and figure out how to do it. We spend a lot of money training them. I'm thinking of some programs that have been canceled in the last few years because of that. But put professionals in charge. And I think that's true at my level too. One thing that we're discussing with the Hill right now is the qualifications for a position like mine. I think in some ways, I don't like to hold myself up as an example, but having someone who has a good operational background is helpful. A technical background is critical. And one of the things in 3.0 is that engineers should run development programs because you can't supervise engineering if you aren't one. It's no more. You can't supervise brain surgery if you're not a surgeon. You can't supervise trial lawyers if you're not a lawyer. You need professionals in charge. If you're supervising defense acquisition system, you really ought to have a technical background, and it ought to be in relevant technologies for the military. But also have a business background so that you understand that. But professionals in general, and our leaders at different levels, whether it's a program executive officer or a service acquisition executive or even a program manager, should all have that mix. And I would add operational experience is a good thing to have so that you're at home with that community and can talk to them in their language. And then you give them the resources they need. That means the time and the money and the people to do their job. The reason that Dave McNichol's chart looks the way it does is that we squeeze programs and we didn't give people the resources they needed, and then we figured that out later on. Budget pressures push us in that direction. It happens in industry too, and I will tell you that what happens in industry when you're bidding, and I've been in a lot of meetings like this, you often go for a final proposal review to the CEO if it's a big program with the company, and you show him what you're going to bid, and the norm is to squeeze you, to try to get more out of the bid, see if it can be more aggressive. Very rarely do you go in the opposite direction. You're trying to win. Winning comes first for industry. So you got to have adequate resources. You got to ensure, we are going through an iteration right now with the bomber. I can't say very much about this for a variety of reasons. But we tried to make sure we had adequate resources for the bomber. I would just say that. In a competition that was very aggressive. And one of the reasons it took us longer to award than we originally planned is we had to sort our way through all that and make sure we were comfortable with where we budgeted that. And then provide strong incentives to succeed. Those incentives cover kind of all levels. When I wrote this, I was thinking more of industry. It's relatively simple. But it also applies to the workforce and it applies to senior managers as well. But if you take those all together, reasonable requirements, putting professionals in charge, giving them the resources they need, and provide strong incentives to succeed, you pretty well got it. The trouble is, it's not simple to write a law or a rule that captures every situation that you're going to have. It actually can't be done. That's why we need flexibility, and that's why we need very competent, capable managers throughout the acquisition system and in industry. So with that, I will stop and take some questions. Thank you. Go sit in the comfy chairs?
Yes, sit in the comfy chairs. And for those of you who missed it on the way in, we did pass out these index cards. So if you have a question, please write it down, and I'm going to run through them here with Mr. Kendall, since he's graciously agreed to join us for some questions.
I think if you want to stick your hand up, that's fine too.
Yeah. But we do have a good list, but keep them coming in if you haven't had a chance to put it up. Just hold it up, and someone will come take it from you. I want to start with an interesting question, given the time of year that we're in, that was submitted by one of our audience, which is the top 2 issues that you expect your successor to face. So, the administration is in that wonderful time where we're thinking about the future and what the next team might look like. And since, as you mentioned, you've had quite a bit of longevity in this position, and the ability to think about the future in a way that maybe was hard to do for folks who just came into the job and were only there for a short time.
Yeah, I think there are 2, Andrew. One is the one I mentioned about adequate resources in the budget to do all the things we need to be doing. We've got about a $12 or $15 billion a year bill coming for the strategic triad. That's going to be in the defense budget somewhere. We talked about different ways to finance that, and some things we can do to make it more efficient. And we show a tick up in 21. It's the first year it starts to really hit with the Ohio replacement. But we've got You know, the bomber's underway now. It's in EMD now. We've got the ICBM replacement really getting going now. And we've got, of course, Ohio replacement. So they're all coming in. We've got the long-range strike LRSO, the cruise missile, coming as well. So that's going to put a lot of stress on the budgets. We need some relief for that. We also have those demonstrations that I talked about and some other things that are starting to get to the phase where you can commit to them for new products, but we don't have the resources right now to do that. So we have to sort out the priorities. So resources would be number one. The other thing, and I'm seeing a kind of a groundswell for this. It's another one of those cyclical things. One of the reasons I was here this morning talking about this data is that I think it is clear to me, at least, how to do well at acquisition. It's not a mystery. The new product development process and getting something through design, fabrication and prototyping, testing, and into production is not a mystery to people. People who have been doing it know how to do it. But if you're going to have cutting edge, best in the world stuff that's a decade ahead of everybody else, you're going to be taking risk as you do that. You're going to have problems. So we will always have problems in development and transition to production. As a result of that, we always have people who are trying to help us fix things, right? And these things are a little bit cyclical. So the original, Packard Commission was one of those cycles. And some of the other things on that chart I showed were other parts of those cycles. I'm kind of sensing, despite the data that shows we're doing a lot better, a cycle right now of more of a laissez-faire kind of an approach. Remove the overhead and the bureaucracy and just give industry the money and let them do the job. And the idea that we can get things quickly, I call it acquisition magic. The idea that, if we just relax constraints, that everything will get better and we'll have much more success. We have tried that multiple times. It doesn't work. But I feel maybe a wave of that kind of thinking kind of coming through right now, and it makes me nervous.
Well, maybe on a related topic, we had about, I think, at least 4 questions submitted on a similar topic, which is the next bomber, the B-21. And the kind of 2 parts to that. One is, what makes the current contract a good business deal? And then what would be the impact if the contract type had to be modified in some way as a result of Congress's...
Are we talking fixed price versus cost plus, I guess? Or
yeah.
other things? Okay. Yeah. May as well say it, right?
Yeah.
A good business deal is one that gets us a product that we need that will meet our needs from a warfighter perspective at a reasonable price, and on which industry makes a reasonable return. So we have set this up, I think, to do that. We have set up pretty strong incentives on the bomber so that if industry doesn't perform, they're going to be impacted in a very negative way, but they're not betting their company. Going back 4 or 5 years, there was interest in doing a fixed price incentive fee on the bomber. I looked at what was in plan and I said, no, absolutely not. Let me talk about fixed price versus cost plus a bit. One of the things in our first report that Phil's people worked on and we put out shows that the results for fixed price versus cost plus in terms of contractor performance don't really vary very much, statistically at least. We had a fad of fixed price development back in the mid to late 80s. And that was about the time I came into the Pentagon the first time. And I spent about half of my period in the Pentagon trying to undo the messes that were created by that. The list of programs that got into trouble under fixed price development is long. But it starts with the A-12, it includes Advanced Cell Protection Jammer, C-17, T-45, there were a whole raft of them. And they came out of an initiative that originally started in the Navy with the leadership of the Navy. So we spent several years trying to figure out how to get those programs back in the box, basically, and get the products that we needed delivered. The problem you have with fixed price development is that when a contractor gets in trouble in fixed price development, which is likely, and I'll explain why in a minute, they're expected to pay whatever they have to pay. They spend their own money to finish the job. And the idea is that's a motivator to them, right? The problem is development's inherently risky. Even a product that's pretty well defined, which we've done good risk mitigation on, there's still risk in development. You're creating something that never existed before. It's a brand new thing. And while we can predict that up to a point, the unknown unknowns tend to bite you. Software is often a problem. We're not good today still at predicting software. So development is inherently risky. So we can set up strong incentives, but have a cost plus environment where we have a lot of flexibility. where if we need to change a requirement, we can. We don't have to go back and get consideration for that, which we would in a fixed price contract. The commercial world does not do fixed price development. I don't know where people get that idea. The commercial world does not do fixed price development. People are spending their own money. They can spend as much as they want. It's cost plus, as long as they can borrow it or raise it somehow, and they will keep going as long as there's a business case. They'll stop when there isn't, but it's cost plus. When you look at the overruns that people pick your company, Boeing, Airbus, Apple, you name it, they've all had problems getting things through development. They don't tell you about it. It's not public because they don't submit a FIDIP with all the programs to the Congress for approval. They submit it to their board of directors, and they tell you how much they're spending on R&D. But you don't know about those overruns. But overruns are common in the commercial world. But it's all cost plus. They keep going as long as they have a business case, and they stop when they don't, or if they run out of money. All right? But it's totally discretionary what they do. That's the commercial model. And the government is a little bit different because we pay somebody else to do our development for us. So the idea is that if you transfer that risk to industry, they will absorb it. The problem is companies have only a finite capacity to absorb risk. When we did the tanker, rather, the KC-46, that is my poster child fixed price development program. I have an article I wrote which talks about 5 criteria. Well-defined requirements that aren't going to change, technologies well in hand, experienced contractors who know how to do the job, contractors with a financial resource to absorb any losses they might encounter, and a business motivation for them to do that, to absorb any losses they might encounter. You write business deals with a good eye towards what happens when things go wrong, not with the assumption things are going to go right. So those are the 5 things. We had all of those for the tanker. It looked like a great case for fixed price development. Boeing has written off about $1.5 billion so far. Well, Boeing, we had fixed requirements. We haven't changed the requirements. The technology is mature pretty much. With new design parts of it, though, they're having some difficulties with some of the new design elements. So it is a new design. It's creating something for the first time. They certainly know how to build airplanes, and they certainly know how to build tankers as well, even though they haven't done one for a while. They have the financial resources, largely because they're half commercial and they make a lot of money in the commercial side. And they still have a business case to do it. They're going to build a lot of production KC-46s and make money on those, we expect. So all those things existed, but the company's written off $1.5 billion. Okay, there would come a point, I think, eventually, where Boeing would say, I don't want to do this anymore. And then our relationship with them would fundamentally change. We would be getting claims from them. If it got extreme enough, you could have what was threatened in the case of the A-12, which is just a default on the contract, and say, okay, government, I can't do it. Sorry, take me to court and see how much you can get. So fixed price is not a panacea, and it is not a commercial model. To me, it's the exception that should be fixed price for development. We need the flexibility to manage it and work with industry, and we can certainly set up incentive structures, and we're doing a better job of this, so that industry has a carrot and a stick in terms of how they perform. We did that with the bomber, and I think we're in the right place on that. So anyway, that's the long version of that story. I think it pretty well summarizes it.
Thank you.
Sorry, you got me going.
That's worth it. So you brought up, obviously, the example of commercial product development, and that kind of raises the issue of the outreach to Silicon Valley.
Sure.
Trying to get to people who are doing product development on their own dime, and maybe doing it in a way that is, at least we hope, faster in some cases than historically the acquisition system has functioned. So a couple of questions were submitted on DIUX. How's it doing, and how overall does that outreach to Silicon Valley fit into your picture of the industrial base?
Let me comment on cycle time a little bit, and then I'll talk about DIUX. The cycle time to do a new product is the cycle time to do a new product. And the way our system works is that I think of it as a layered system. The bottom layer is industry doing the work. It's the contractors who are out there working on the design and building the prototypes and so on. So there's that layer of working activity. Then there's a layer of direct management of those people. There's the program managers and their staffs, basically. Then there's a layer of oversight and staff stakeholders and other people. Then there's acquisition executives like myself, right? So while this layer at the bottom is doing all the work, the layers above it in government are doing other things to some extent. They're having dabs, or they're doing documentation and so on. That bureaucracy does not stop the work. We generally have gotten, so we know when to start building our documents to support a decision so that we don't stop the work and halt it while we're making a decision. That's very rare. So it's not true to say that the acquisition system is slowing down the work. The work is going on. Okay? On top of that, by the way, above the acquisition executive and the secretary, there's the Congress trying to write laws that get the work done better way down through all those layers, which is another difficulty you have when you go with that. So, and I showed you some data that shows that cycle times are not slowing down. In fact, what happens if you adopt the approach that was shown on that first chart I showed, of just handing money to the industry and hoping for the best, you don't get better results. That's not a good way to do business. Brings me to DIUX. What the idea of DIUX is that we need to be tapping into two things better than we are. One of them is commercial technologies. And the idea there is that we can accelerate the movement of commercial technologies into DoD. I was a chief engineer for one of the defense companies. I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley then. Our defense companies are not ignorant of the existence of Silicon Valley or all the other places that are high-tech centers, nor are our national laboratories or government laboratories, DoD laboratories. But if we engage those people more directly, the idea is that we can get them to get engaged with us more quickly. We can identify technologies earlier. We can bring it into the department more quickly. So there's that piece of it. There's another piece of it which is about the intellectual capital. That's not thinking about national security issues or problems. It's thinking about, the next big thing that they're going to do with their startup to become post-economic, I think is the right term. That means you've got so much money you don't care about economics anymore. So we want to get some of those creative minds working on our problems. So that was the idea. DIUX has been out there for the better part of a year now. We opened it up last summer. We've done a lot of events. We've worked with a lot of companies. We've got a fair number of transactions in progress. The secretary's, I don't want to telegraph something, but the secretary's going to be on the West Coast tomorrow. He's going to be talking about the future of DIUX. So I will say that you can expect him to announce some adjustments in DIUX. And I don't want to go any further than that now and steal his thunder. But it's set up to be an experiment. It is. I think it's been a successful experiment, but I think we're going to make some adjustments in the near future.
Stay tuned. Well, you referenced a couple times and just now about Congress. So we had a question on the latest congressional efforts on acquisition reform and your assessment of them. So let's go with that next.
Yeah, we have worked with the HASC in particular very cooperatively. What Chairman Thornberry did was put out a law essentially it was a draft, but he filed it as a bill, I think, so that it would be in the public domain. I've had multiple meetings with him, and my staff and his staff have worked together, as have the service staffs. The final bill that's come out of committee is one that we're pretty happy with. He did have some rigidity in earlier versions, which I'm very delighted that he took out. We've got to have some flexibility to manage specific cases. The thing that stimulated that comment was some initial language on modularity and open systems, which dictated that everything be modular and open systems. You can't always do that. I mean, the example I give is if you look under the hood of your car, which a lot of us probably don't do very often anymore, you look under the hood of your car today, it is completely packed with stuff. There's no air that you can see there, basically. And they're very tightly interwoven with each other, all the different systems that exist in a modern car. If you pick up the hood of a car from the 50s, there's mostly air there. You can see around the whole motor. It's all sitting there on motor mounts. Some designs are so integrated and so dense and so constrained by things like space and weight and power considerations that you really can't do with modular, maybe even an open system. So we need flexibility on that. Modular has been part of our lexicon for decades now. We haven't always enforced it. There's resistance to it, frankly, from industry for reasons of self-interest. But we've been pushing and we've been more successful more recently. So I'm okay with the guidance as a general practice, but there are some designs where you just don't have the freedom.
Earlier this year, or I think actually...
By the way, I didn't talk about the Senate.
Oh, well, would you like to?
Well, I don't know what the Senate's going to do, okay? We've had some conversations at the staff level, and we're just waiting to see what comes out of the SASC this time.
Yeah, well, soon. It's going to be an eventful week. You also had a question on earlier this year, and actually I think somewhat last year, you talked about the possibility of requesting legislation specific to industry consolidation and how those mergers are reviewed. And so we have a question, actually, that Aaron has self-identified himself, Aaron Maida from Defense News, asked about your thoughts and plans on potential legislation there.
I've withdrawn the legislation. We had some draft legislation in the interagency process. What happened, a lot of you probably followed this, but we had the Department of Justice and the FTC, who were the regulatory agencies for merger and acquisition, antitrust in particular, and we had a dialogue that led to them issuing a statement, which I was quite happy with. They consulted, DOJ in particular consulted with us on it. And the need for the legislation, I think because of that statement they issued clarifying the scope of the law, satisfied the concern that I had. I came out of the, and by the way, this is nothing negative on Lockheed or Sikorsky. I think Lockheed made a very reasonable strategic move to acquire Sikorsky. But my concerns about the trend over decades now to have a smaller and smaller number of weapon system prime contractors. This basically eliminated Sikorsky as a prime and made them part of Lockheed. And just the structural changes have all been monotonically going in one direction. And I found through that process, or I thought I had found, that I had less, or the government had less discretion on how these cases were reviewed and what we considered than I thought we should have. And that was what led to the idea of a legislative initiative. But I'm now persuaded by DOJ and FTC that that's not necessary.
Excellent. Last year's NDAA, since we're kind of on our legislative topic kick, one of the main elements of that was, I would say, turning the tide a little bit or changing the approach on commercial item determination. I think for years there had been a push from Congress to maybe move away from commercial or to be very tight in how you deal with commercial. Last year's bill was a marked change. It was encouraging easier commercial item determinations.
We get pushed in both directions.
Yeah.
There are some people who are really strongly advocating for more commercial practices. And there are others who are advocating for much tighter government oversight of what we're paying for things. Been a number of IG reports on what we're paying for parts primarily that cite high markups on parts. I don't think we're ever going to get this perfect. We try to strike the right balance. It affects a few companies more than others. The government buys commercially most of the time. Almost everything we buy, that we use in our offices, for example, that we use for vehicles and so on, outside of weapon systems anyway, is commercial. The DoD is a little bit unique in that we go out and pay people to develop products just for us, because nobody else needs weapons, right? And the things associated with them. Where it gets difficult is things that are kind of in the gray area, and it often shows up in parts, helicopter parts, for example, where a part may be listed as commercial, but you have to check and see are there any actual commercial sales of it. And sometimes there are, and sometimes there aren't. Our contracting officers have an obligation to get a reasonable price for the government. If there's a commercial market that exists that sets a price, we assume it's reasonable. If there's an actual competitive market for the whatever we're buying. But if the data shows that there isn't, then we have to inquire about, sometimes about cost. And industry doesn't like providing cost. Now, we want firms to do business with us. So, and cost structure for firms is very important proprietary information. They don't want that revealed. So if we want to, anyway, I can talk about this for a long time, but we're trying to get the balance right. We're trying to speed up the process of determining whether something's commercial or not. And we're trying to put some people in place who have the expertise to assess whether the price is reasonable based on what it is, as opposed to going and getting cost data from the contractor. So I think we're iterating in the right direction on this. I don't think we'll ever be 100% perfect. We're just trying to get the right balance. I don't think we can go to just general commercial practices for things like weapon systems. We're too unique of a customer. We have a requirement to protect the taxpayer's interest, get the best value for the warfighter. The government is not, I have said this to the major primes, their businesses are not growth businesses or commercial businesses in the normal sense. We're rare in that we pay R&D for our products, generally speaking. We have a very strong value in the government of fairness to all of our competitors, people who bid to us. And we have something called protest as a result of that. If you think about it for a minute, in commercial practices, is there such a thing as a protest? It doesn't exist. People are spending their own money. They can spend it anywhere they want. Whether they're fair to who they're buying from or not, who cares? It's their money. Government's not like that. Government has an obligation to be fair. We also have an enormous amount of legislative constraints and provisions about how we do business. You know, which, and by the way, if we were a very serious attempt at acquisition reform, would take a clean sheet of paper and go look at the whole structure of the FAR and everything in it that governs how we're doing contracting, and ask ourselves, do we really need all of this? Almost everything in there is well-intentioned, but it makes doing business with the government very different than doing commercial business. And there's a cost associated with all of that. You know, again, well-intended, lots and lots of different reasons why things are in there, but that document's that thick because we keep getting additional provisions imposed by law.
Well, actually, we had a question related to that from an attaché from one of our partner nations about Buy America.
Yeah.
And the question as posed was, is better buying power part of Buy America, or is there a Buy America slant to it? But I think more broadly, the question is, how much of an impact does Buy America requirements have on the system?
It has some impact on the margins. What better buying power actually has the opposite of that in there. It talks about greater reliance on our partners. We have to. We can't afford to develop everything ourselves. We can take advantage of other people. There are a lot of qualified, very capable nations in the world. Many of them were very close relationship with the United States. We have a good example of that, one that 20 years ago when we started the program, I would not have expected actually to succeed, is the F-35. You know, the 8 original partners all still in. You know, we have worked our way through a lot of different issues there, but that's been a very productive and successful partnership. There are a couple of countries that are kind of on the edge of whether they can actually buy airplanes or not. And I don't know how that will come out, but even if those countries didn't, I'd still say that this was a great international cooperative success. I give a lot of credit to our partners who are contributing to the aircraft in very major ways. So I think we need to rely more on our partners around the world rather than less, because financial situation and the threats dictate that. Buy American hits a lot of things on the margin. A lot of specific products are affected by it. We've had quite a long-standing discussion about running shoes, for example, in the department. And we have specialty metals constraints and other things that affect us as well that we have to work our way through. But on the whole, I think we need to be working together, and I think that can be a win-win. You know, I think we sell far more weapon systems. Our balance of trade in defense and aerospace is very positive, and we should recognize that. And also recognize that we get great contributions from our partners, and that we shouldn't be discouraging that.
Do you see the possibility of doing another major international joint development program again in the future, in the near future or the middle-term future?
I would probably say the middle-term future. There are a few things that, my problem right now is getting things started into the budget, right? It's that lack of new starts that's bothering me. And the strategic triad is probably not a place where we would do that, although we have a very close partnership on Ohio replacement because there's a lot of commonality with the United Kingdom and their strategic deterrent. So other than that, I don't think that's an area where we're probably going to do a lot of cooperative work, although I wouldn't exclude the possibility. Other new starts, yes, but it takes a little time in everybody's political system to get to where you're ready to commit to something like that. So things that are a few years out, maybe some of the products that might come out of some of the demonstrations I talked about might provide that kind of an opportunity. So we're open to that. I'm actively looking for a cooperative opportunity for something significant with India. The Defense Technology and Trade Initiative that I've been leading for the department, trying to build a strategic relationship with India in the area of acquisition. We've got some small co-development programs, 2 started, 2 in the pipeline. I would like to find something that makes sense for us to do together that's larger in scale. We just haven't found the fit yet. So a lot of it is about finding the point where there's agreement on the requirements, the timing is right, the financing is right, but certainly open to things like that.
Well, we had a question submitted. You talked about the balance of trade on one of your initiatives, Defense Exportability Fund and the Defense Exportability Features.
Yeah. Defense Exportability Features is the idea that, you know, what our historical practice has been, we develop a product for ourselves, for the DoD, and then after we fielded it, we start looking around and thinking about foreign sales. Certainly the industry is looking around and thinking about foreign sales. And our partners may be attracted to it because they know we have. And then we have to look at what we might have to do to modify it for export reasons, right? So you design that in as an afterthought after you finish the design for the U.S. So the idea of exportability features was to do that up front. And any variation you had to do on the design for exportability, anti-tamper, for example, you could do up front and have that design ready for foreign sales at the same time it was ready for the U.S. So we have pilot authority to do this from the Congress. We're doing it in a cost-sharing way with industry. Industry has to see a business case for themselves in this. If there isn't a business case for them as well as for the department. The business case for us is higher sales quantities lead to economic returns, more economic order quantities and lower prices for the U.S. Business case for industry obviously is increased sales. The business case for the partner buying it is he gets a capable product earlier than he would have otherwise. So it works out for everybody. So we have a few pilots going on in that area. We're going to continue to try to do that.
Now we're getting to questions that are a little less thematically linked, but some good ones. We had a question on how OCO funding will potentially continue to play a role in defense acquisition, specifically in the acquisition arena.
OCO, generally speaking, has been focused on operational costs. The part that's been contracted out has been the services supporting troops that are deployed. There has been some procurement in there, largely replacement items. Been a little bit of R&D for things like IEDs, for example. With the latest budget deal, there is more in the OCO account on the margins. And of course, we have the HACK initiative to make a fundamental change there, which we think is not the right way to go. So OCO is uncertain funding. It should be operationally related, and so it generally is not funding that's in certainly the longer range R&D side of the house, and we're generally not in the recapitalization side of procurement. And I think we should stay that way. I don't think we should change that.
We had a question on the status of doing joint acquisitions with other agencies. DHS is mentioned here. I might just throw in moderator's discretion and also VA, since I know that you're working hard on a program with them on health records.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where it makes sense, we're certainly open to that. There's a group that meets quarterly that I chaired, now Alan Estevez chairs as my deputy, with DHS that looks at opportunities like that. The VA thing has had a long and interesting history, which isn't over yet, by the way. We think we ended up in reasonable places for the two departments. We're well into the process of getting ready to field a modern healthcare system, healthcare information management system for our patients, record system. VA is working their way through upgrading their current system, and I think there may be some uncertainty in VA about, based on testimony that I've read, where they're going to end up on that. So we continue to work very closely with them there. What we've worked most closely with VA on is interoperability. There's been this mistaken impression that we're not interoperable with VA, and we have to go buy a new healthcare system to be interoperable. That's not the case. We're interoperable with VA now. We just certified to the Congress that we're interoperable. And we've done that through, I'll call them appliques to a number of things. But one of them is getting the data digitized and standardized. Another thing is an interface system that allows data to be moved and accessed in DoD or VA by people from either department, which has been, I think there are like 60,000, maybe even more than that, users of that system right now in the DoD and VA.
I want to transition now to the third topic that I hoped we could focus on in this conversation, which is the acquisition workforce.
Yeah.
But I'm going to cheat a little bit and throw in there as the first question, because they're now, in some sense, part of the acquisition force, the service chiefs, because their role in the process has been enhanced, and obviously along with that comes a requirement on their part, which many of them have acknowledged, is to deepen their understanding of acquisition. But how do you see that going? Their efforts to get more involved or to be more involved.
To be perfectly honest, it's not having much direct impact on me right now. I am seeing within the services that she's taking a more active role within their service processes, particularly on requirements. We were always, the department, the secretary and deputy and myself, were always positively disposed towards the idea that she was taking on a greater role. They already are responsible for requirements, but they often have delegated that. They already are responsible for their budget. They're certainly responsible for personnel. So they can have a huge impact on all of those things, which are directly central to acquisition. The place where I get a little bit nervous about the chiefs is that they generally don't have an acquisition professional background. John Richardson's kind of an exception right now. So they don't understand contracting strategies or risk mitigation, some of the things that are more central to the actual activities of acquisition. So I would be reluctant to turn that over to them. But I want their input, and I think the acquisition chain needs their input on things like urgency. If something's needed, desperately right now, we're going to do it with a much more high-risk approach than we would otherwise. But we need to figure that out. And I have seen, the chiefs have always been fairly influential, and it's been to some degree a choice as to how involved they were. But we're very happy with their increased involvement. And I am seeing General Milley in the Army, for example, get much more engaged on the requirements side. He's asked for some authorities, I think, in his report to the Congress at least, which go further than I would be comfortable with. But none of the other service chiefs have taken that a path. Mark Welch actually worked in acquisition for a little while, a couple of years. And his reaction I thought was precious, was priceless. Was, that stuff's hard, and I don't know how to do that, so don't ask me to do that. He's right. But, people are people, and they like to, control things and do things. So anyway, I think I'm fine with that, and so far it's working out just fine, as far as I can tell.
Well, when Bill LaPlante was here a couple of weeks ago, he had nothing but praise for how General Welch participated and programs that he had experience with.
I mean, they're the customer, okay? They're the people we're doing this for. So we want to satisfy our customers, right? And we should.
You brought up urgency. New question came in about how you see, the approach of Better Buying Power 3.0, achieving dominant technical capabilities, fitting in with this push for urgency, for speed and agility in the acquisition system.
Let me comment about that. I kind of alluded to this earlier. You got to be the Ben Franklin thing about haste makes waste. You got to be a little careful about that. And sometimes when we try to go fast, we just have a mess. So you've got to balance that. How much risk do you take, and where do you take it, and what kind of mitigation do you do? I'll give you the Ford aircraft carrier. And by the way, we're pulled very hard in both directions. We're pulled pretty hard in the direction of go faster, take more risk, fail early, fail often and well. And why are you having that cost overrun? What's wrong with you? How could you let that happen? Right? So we get both of those. That's kind of the nature of the beast. So we try to get the right balance. And how urgent a need is matters. What I try to do is set up programs that I look at, make sure they're set up for a reasonable chance of success. And I err slightly on the side of being a little bit aggressive on schedule, with the expectation that I may have to give up some schedule, but I'd rather be there and working towards that, I won't call it a stretch goal, but that challenging goal, than being more relaxed about how I set up the program. That ends up with perhaps some schedule slips that we have to, go up and explain why they're happening, and maybe even some cost increases that we have to go up. But I think it's a better place to be. Then there's a school of thought that's just, be very aggressive about your schedule. And one of the things that's true in this business is that you will always find people who will come in and advertise that if you give me a bunch of money, I can do it half as fast and, less money. Just give me the money and I promise. That generally doesn't work out too well. So anyway, it's getting the balance right is where we're trying to be. I think we're doing a pretty good job of that, as the data shows. But there are times, and one of the models in the 5002 for acquisition is called, I think, accelerated acquisition, which is where you skip the risk reduction phase. The way you go, there are two ways to go fast. Well, there are three. One is to do a risk reduction prototype and just buy more of them. And when we do that, we tend to end up with things that are, reliability and operating environment disasters. Global Hawk was one of those. And we fielded a risk reduction prototype of Global Hawk in numbers and had horrible sustainment performance. And we decided because of that, we were going to cancel that program and keep U2 forever. Well, talk about incentives, right? Northrop Grumman was motivated to get those sustainment costs down. We had predicted that they would, and Sure enough, a couple years later, they're way down, and now the economics have flipped back. But we got into that situation because we went to rapid prototyping. Sometimes operationally, that's the right thing to do because you need the capability right away. So that's one way you get in trouble. One way you can go fast. Another way to go fast is to skip the risk reduction phase. Develop the technology while you're doing the design. So don't do risk mitigation on the high risk things first before you commit to the design for production. That's the TMRR phase. Just do it all at once. And what happens then is you've got an EMD program is sort of a marching army of engineers doing all aspects of the design. And what happens is that army's all moving along, and then one group of engineers gets into trouble somewhere. And the whole rest of the army has to stop and wait for them. And you're burning money while you're doing that. That's why you do risk reduction early. So if you're gambling on the technology maturing as you're doing the design, that's the risk you're running, and that's often realized risk. The other way is concurrency. And you just commit to production early, and you hope the design's okay. And you figure you're going to fix anything that gets wrong with it later on when you get into testing results. That's what we did in the F-35. Acquisition malpractice, right? Again, these are all difficult, balanced judgments people have to make when they set up a program. But when I look at a program, I look at how we're handling the risk profile of the program and whether we've got reasonable resources and reasonable risk mitigation steps in place. So I think I've got a fair shot at executing it as planned. And that's what it takes to get a program through me. In a case where it's a truly urgent need, MRAP's a good example, we just do some of those things that I described as ways to go fast. And you hope it works out. Often, in one way or another, it doesn't, and you have to clean up a mess. But at the end of the day, you may still get there faster.
You talked about some of the challenges of sustainment in fielding something that was a prototype, or I'm going to extend that now to questions submitted on non-developmental items. And the assertion of the question is that it seems like it takes a department just as long to buy something that's non-developmental as something that's developmental.
It doesn't, but I do have a problem internally that I'm working on now. 5002, the DODI that governs acquisition, has 4 or 5 different models of ways to structure programs. The idea of putting not just one model in was to get people to think about what was the right approach for their program. So some hybrid of multiple models, maybe. Accelerated acquisition is one of them. I didn't put a model in there for non-developmental items or commercial off the shelf. And I'm doing it a new issue, I guess. I'm not rewriting it, but we're making some changes because of the NDAA and a couple of other things. I'm putting a cybersecurity enclosure in. But I'm also going to put in something that covers NDI, because our system tends to want to treat everything the same. It's been interesting with the test community, in particular, both the DT and the OT test community, that if we're buying something in a commercial way, it's a different sort of testing. It's acceptance testing or verification testing that you're doing. It's not developmental testing where you're trying to do a workup through the design process. But what our institutions tend to know how to do is that, so they try to apply that model. So I think in practice, we work our way through that. Most things aren't completely non-developmental. We always put our own radios in, we put our own networking in maybe. The Marines are doing advanced combat vehicle right now, amphibious combat vehicle that is a good example of an NDI program, near NDI, but they are making a few modifications to the vehicle. So there's going to have to be some testing associated with that. But anyway, I think we need to tailor what we do more for those kinds of products than we're used to doing.
Circling back to the acquisition workforce, Force of the Future has been one of the major initiatives of the Secretary. And I haven't heard a lot, you may have done this and I just haven't seen it, but it seems to me there's natural overlay or relationship here to the acquisition workforce,
oh, there is.
Which is a highly technical workforce.
There is.
And one that needs some rejuvenation in terms of the demographics. So.
No, there is. Renee Thomas-Rizzo is my director for the Human Capital Initiative for Acquisition Workforce. She worked very closely with, it was Brad Carson at the time, on the Force of the Future set of initiatives. And we're very happy with a lot of things that are in there. The idea that the Secretary has of greater permeability is, I think, terrific. And when I was growing up in this business back in the 80s, really, and early 80s, it was routine for people to come from industry into positions in the Pentagon or in government and then go back. It's very hard to do now because of ethics constraints and a number of other things. But it was considered career enhancing for an executive in industry, kind of at mid-career, to come spend 2 or 3 years in the government and then go back to industry. It gives you a much better understanding of the customer to do that. And the benefit to the government was that technical talent coming in and having people who had recent industry experience. That's pretty rare now. It's almost unheard of. I hired somebody recently to be Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategic Intel and Space Systems, who is approaching the end of his career. Definitely not there yet, but he wanted to come in from industry to spend some time kind of giving back and working in government. We're also using the Defense Digital Service people. These are post-economic commercial software people, basically, who we're using to go out and troubleshoot and actually do hands-on work with some of our programs that have gotten in trouble. And that's working out very well. That's something Secretary Carter strongly encouraged. So we are looking for ways to be more permeable. Force the Future has some in there, more flexibility on compensation. It turns out that we're not using some of our existing authorities nearly enough. Things like highly qualified experts and individual program augmentees who could, it's a vehicle to bring people in, pay them something that's more commercial, closer to commercial rates, and have them do a term of service with the government. That's enormously valuable. But in an era of austere budgets and general decline in our workforce, it's been difficult for people to do that.
We'll get a little more philosophical with you now. In terms of, and this is something we frequently do when we have senior military folks here, because we often have a lot of more junior military folks in the audience, and I think we have a more senior audience here today, but there's always folks out there watching and listening who are more junior. So I just want to give you an opportunity to think about what advice you give someone who's entering the acquisition field. What should they be doing to prepare or think about as their career objectives if they're interested in getting into acquisition?
Well, first of all, prepare yourself academically. You need to be majoring in things that are going to be relevant. I'm biased, I'm an engineer, but I think basically if you're concerned about technological superiority and you're concerned about cutting edge design and you want to manage programs that are that nature, you need to have an engineering background. Get as much experience as you can. I would say that means changing what you're doing every once in a while so that you're expanding on your portfolio of skills. Try to get some time with industry. We don't do nearly enough exchanges with industry. And if you're a headquarters kind of a person, try to get out to where the real work is being done as much as you can, so that you're not there. Seek opportunities for hands-on work. I was trained. I was a captain in the Army, and I had a chance to work on missile defense for what was then the Peacekeeper system. And this was before the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was a few years before Reagan announced that. So my initial exposure to people doing acquisition work for the federal government was partly with the Army R&D organization I was with, but the big program office we were working with was the Ballistic Missile Office out at San Bernardino. And the people who became my models for how to do acquisition management from a government perspective were the Air Force colonels I worked with out there. Who, I was a captain, they were a lot senior to me. They were running major parts of the Peacekeeper program. And I sat in on design reviews with these guys. I watched them look at engineering trade studies, work with the contractor. So I saw how they managed contractors and how they were personally deeply engaged in the job of producing the product that they were trying to produce. So I think get experience like that. And I was lucky enough to have a series of jobs that were very technically and managerially challenged. And I think that's the sort of background you need if you're going to take on the job eventually of running a major program.
Great. Well, I've got one last question I haven't yet asked, and it's nice. It kind of brings us back full circle because I asked you about your successor. The last question that I have is submitted was, would you serve in another administration?
I've still got to get through this one. I don't. The short answer is yes. I like my job. I think I'm making a difference, and I think that continuity matters. So I would consider that possibility if the option appeared. I'll put it that way. How's that? That's a good political answer. How's that?
Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
But I'm not committing to that, okay?
No commitment.
If my wife is listening, I'm not committing to that.
All right. It's just among us here in the room.
Okay, just among us. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation. Thanks to you to the audience for great questions, and please show your appreciation to Mr. Kendall
Thank
for
you.
giving us.